What we do though, when we're helping a client buy, whether it's for a holiday home or an owner occupier, it's always about making sure that we're protecting the resale of that property. So is there going to be mass demand for that when you go to sell? There's no point buying something that's cheap that nobody wants, because you're going to inherit that problem when you go to sell it.
Our motto is buy without regrets, and so
if you can buy a property that will serve you for 10 years as opposed to 3 years, that will serve you well. And something
buying a great property today, that's not just what it's about. It's also getting something that could be ripe for improvement when the time is right for that investor or for the next buyer.
You think about, right, lifestyle, what's important to you? How do you get to work? What do you need for your family? What amenities like parks and shops? Then you look at the budget.
Welcome to Street Secrets. I'm Chris Bates. I'm a mortgage broker since 2013. And in this podcast, we're going to be interviewing Australia's leading buyer's agents, ones with decades of experience, have the local insider knowledge on the street, and can really help you with your buying process, no matter whether you're a first home buyer, upgrader, investor. In this podcast, you'll get access to Australia's leading buyer's agents' minds every week on a Thursday. What's the word on the street? Welcome to Street Secrets. I'm Chris Bates in the studio today with Michael Sier from BuyerX. We're going to a part of the country that I've been wanting to cover for so long. Pretty stunning part of Australia, the Mornington Peninsula. But it's also had a pretty interesting run over the last few years, and there's a lot going on and a lot of probably misunderstanding about what's going on. So it's going to be a good chat to talk to someone who absolutely knows that market. Thanks for joining us today, Michael.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Michael, before we sort of go into a bit of detail around the Mornington sort of pocket, can you give me an understanding about sort of how long you've sort of been working within the sort of property buyers agency space, and how long you've been acting as a buyer's agent for, and what you were doing prior?
Yeah, sure. Well, I guess my journey started 20 plus years ago when I wanted to buy my first home and was in IT and had no idea about property. And so I thought, well, I don't know what I'm doing, but I know I need help. And was either get parents to help or look for some professionals. And the biggest barrier for me was, well, I can't afford to pay for an advocate, but I had a skill that I thought maybe was of use to an advocate. So I reached out to probably the most prominent advocate in Melbourne at the time, Mel James. And I said to Mel, look, I can't afford to pay you, but I can build you some software. Is there anything that you'd like in your business? Can we do a barter? And he was on board with that straight away. He said, yeah, absolutely. I've got all these ideas. And so he helped me buy my first property and I helped him build some software for his business. And it was really that process that I went through where I really got my first taste of property and really enjoyed that journey. And I didn't want it to end. And so, my relationship with Mel became one of a mentor, but also an employer. I was working for myself at the time and he offered me a job and said, why don't you come and work with me full time, which I did. And, learned the ropes, really the whole part of the business, whether it was, the marketing, the lead generation, how the advocates worked within the business with the software that they used and their due diligence, the strategy around how clients were taken through that buying journey and how they negotiated or bid at auction. And I really learned everything about that business. And I was in that business for probably 4 or 5 years before I then decided to start my own business. And so that was my entry into advocacy. And from there, I started a business with another advocate, and it was called Performance Property. And we really focused on buying investment properties in areas that were showing potential at the bottom of the cycle, sort of value investing methodology, and went around and really built quite a strong business, which is still running today. And that's really focused on building portfolios for investors. And at the time it was all residential. Now that they've expanded into different classes. But I guess what I learned from that was being based on the peninsula and working in the city, my time was being really, really stretched. And I know that a lot of people do commute, but 5 days a week was really wearing me thin. So I thought to myself, what can I do on the peninsula where I can use my skill set? It's not necessarily an investment market, but at the time we also had a lot of owner occupiers that were investors that wanted to upgrade their family home because they'd done so well with their investing. So BuyerX was born really out of a need for a service for those clients, and also an idea for me to be able to have a bit more balance in my life, but also build a model out where we could have some area specialisation, where we could help the clients in really defined areas where we knew really well, and only focus on one part of their property journey, but be really holistic with the view that we had on what they were buying and where they were buying and when they were buying.
Yeah, I think it's kind of what we absolutely believe as well, right, around sort of that local specialist. I think the BuyerX as a business is sort of offering that, right? You can focus on your pocket, that pocket, be a great BA in that pocket, and we'll give you, services and support and tech and web, all those sort of things. If we sort of go around sort of the Mornington Peninsula pocket where you've sort of been working, for the last, I think 6, 7, 8 years as a BA down there. I mean, what a ride, right? You could have picked in a more interesting market, I would say. I mean, we, if I reflect on that sort of late teens time, and we had multiple clients. I've lived in Melbourne, a bunch of times, and a lot of clients were doing well in Melbourne. Could sort of commute 2-3 times a week to the city. This is even pre-COVID, and when you could see what you could get for your money and the lifestyle down Mornington, it was just such a really attractive. And then obviously that went turbocharged through COVID. Could you sort of, from someone who was in that market, how have you seen it in different stages? And, and then I guess, how do you sort of see it playing out longer term, and what's the next stage that we're going to pivot to at some point?
Yeah, you're right. And I think, the Peninsula is a very immature market for advocates because it isn't an investment market. So you don't have all of the buyer's agents that are hotspotting and creating awareness. So it's really a lifestyle market that has owner-occupiers and holiday homes. And so it does, I guess it's a really traditional real estate market where the agent becomes a bit of a buyer's agent when they're selling a house because they may not have the listing for the customer that wants to buy, so they end up finding them something. So it was actually quite a difficult market to break into because there weren't really any advocates down here when I started. So I had the challenge of trying to start a service in a market that wasn't really looking for that service in a time when property was a little bit weak already. So for the first year or so, I really had a handful of clients, and it wasn't until, that 1920 period where people wanted to leave Melbourne and have that work from home and time with the family and more space and things like that, when the market really went through a boom period. And we had a lot of relocation clients who didn't know the area but still wanted to keep their jobs in Melbourne, and so that really drove a lot of demand in the northern areas like Mount Martha, Mornington and Mount Eliza in particular, because they still had access to transport, either for driving on the freeway or the train from Frankston. And so I went from having a handful of clients to buying a property almost every week in 2021. And then 2022, we had all the interest rate rises and we had some land tax changes, and then the market just really started to cool. So it was a real roller coaster of sort of trying to establish myself, crazy busy, and then it sort of backed off again. And so now it's actually back to quite a normal, stable market. It's definitely the time of year, it's a bit weaker, but we have a sensible level of transactions, time to actually get proper due diligence and really take a client through a journey. You're not sort of rushing to an auction and competing against a handful of buyers. You're now sort of able to take your time, make sure it's really right for you, and buy. If you've got complex terms and things like that, it's not going to stop you from being a buyer. So I think where it's headed is, we do follow Melbourne's cycle, and Melbourne looks like it's at the bottom, and investors are starting to return, and so we'll see that flow-on effect down on the peninsula.
Yeah, it's interesting. The 2019 where the agent was kind of acting as a quasi buyer's agent and guiding a client and trying to basically find them a property so they can get a sale. Did they sort of they sort of aunties that are working with you? I mean, not saying you, but just they sort of saw their role almost competing a little bit, and you sort of didn't have that value proposition like you do now, where they trust you and they'll probably give you the access and things that you've worked at building that relationship. It sort of made your job a lot harder in those early days because you had to sort of build that trust with the agents.
It did, yeah. I think agents that had only ever worked down here had never really dealt with advocates before, and so there was this sort of you're the enemy type attitude. Ones that had started in Melbourne had moved down, they got it, they understood it. So yeah, it did take time to build rapport and relationships and earn trust. That's in the past now, but it was definitely, and I'm not an advocate that goes in and tries to ruffle feathers and start fights. Like I'm very respectful, and I work with agents and respect their time and try to do the right thing. So I think that sort of helped build those relationships quickly as well. But now you're right. Whenever I call up and want to get through a property, they know I'm not there just wasting time. I've either got a client or, there's a genuine reason for it. And it's something that they're happy to do privately because they know that, that it's a good use of their time, and it's not just someone, driving down from Melbourne has no idea whether it's even the right suburb for their client.
Yeah, I imagine in these holiday markets, it's definitely, becoming more and more an owner-occupied market. I'm sure that's probably part of the pivot it's starting to make now. We're from a second home market to a first home market, I guess, which I'd love your understanding. But I imagine there's a lot of people just looking at properties just because they're, basically, tire kickers, really. And I imagine that they dealt with a lot of BAs in that COVID period where, they were just a Melbourne BA that's all of a sudden they've got a crossbreed from Hawthorn to, Mount Martha, and, or, they're just a random client just sort of wasting their time. So you sort of, I guess, working through that period, you probably got a lot of runs on the board that are really helping you now, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. And I think during that period, there's a lot of people buying holiday homes. And so a lot of Zoom auctions, a lot of people buying sight unseen when there were certain lockdown restrictions. And crazy times. Let's hope that doesn't happen again. But what we are seeing now, though, is less holiday home buyers, more owner occupiers, which is really our business model anyway, to support those buyers that they're looking for somewhere to plant their roots and grow their family and support them in the long term, whether it's their schooling or education, jobs, things like that. So what we're seeing is really a shift, particularly traditional areas like Sorrento and Portsea and Blairgowrie, where, they were mostly holiday homes and retirees. And, you're now seeing lots more families move into those areas. So buyer types are changing. And, the need for an advocate, I think, is even more so with, just not understanding what's the right community fit for you. Is it going to support your lifestyle objectives now and in the future?
Yeah, I imagine you've got a lot of, because you've got choice, right? You can go a bit further away, maybe a bit more of a commute. Is the commute important to you? The kids' schoolings and, is that sort of doing a lot of your work because a lot of people are moving there. Maybe they didn't grow up there, or they're moving, back there. Is a lot of work sort of really guiding into the challenges of, and where there is a lot of second homes and where there's not, and is you spending a lot of your times sort of making sure they get the right suburb and the pocket of those suburbs is where a lot of your value adds. Yeah.
It's something that you got to get right from the beginning, because it'll shorten your search time dramatically if you get that right in that first few weeks that you're working with a client. And what we tend to do is, especially if they don't have any knowledge of the areas at all, and they just have a budget and a very basic brief, we get them to jump in the car with us and we drive them around for a day and we explain all of the different precincts in the suburbs that would match their budget and their sort of lifestyle objectives. And we explain, the types of properties that they can afford, the areas, what the demographics are like, what the lifestyle's like in those areas. And we really rule out 80% of what they thought they could, or they would, might be interested in. And so it really narrows that focus down. We still look, outside the square a little bit on their briefs, just in case there's things that we've missed. But, I feel like the value is understanding them really well early. So we're really only looking at properties that make sense in areas that they're going to be happy. And I think that's the biggest mistake you can make as a buyer in an area you don't know is to fall in love with a house, and you end up being in a location that after a few years you don't want to be in anymore. There's the sunk cost of your stamp duty and your selling agent's fee to move, and then any change in the market in the time. So that's something that we really get right early, is helping that client understand, is that area meeting their needs for their lifestyle right now and in the future?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because I think you love the house, you even love the street and your neighbours, but you just don't love the broader area, or it just doesn't match the life you want to live, right? The school runs or the city, and so you've got the mortgage, you've got the house, but it just doesn't feel right. And I think it's quite a bad position, because you sort of get stuck there, right? You sort of, you don't want to pay his transaction costs again. You don't want to pay, and go through the whole process again. So you get stuck there, and this sort of just grills on you a bit in the background. If you think about the sort of the market, I mean, do you break it into different tiers or different pockets, like that you gravitate to the northern suburbs if they have to go to, have to get to the city, or, a bit more an older couple, they gravitate toward the acreage or the bigger blocks, or, maybe a bit further down? Like, how do you sort of, break the Mornington? Because it's quite a big area when you sort of, in terms of land size. How do you sort of
it's really
think about
vast.
It?
It can be over an hour's drive from one end to the other. So you've got, the further away from Melbourne, the less people want to commute. So, there is a Peninsula Freeway. There's been a lot of closures and resurfacing going on and driving the locals crazy. That looks like it's all behind us now. But, essentially Dramana is kind of the end of that freeway, and that's really as far as people generally are willing to travel to Melbourne for work. So you've got the top end geographically, Dramana through to Mount Eliza, that's a mixture of locals who work locally or in the city. Past that, you really have retirees and locals who work locally and have schools locally, right down to sort of Flinders on the Western Port side, where it's really, there's an acreage market, there's a very small township market, a lot of retirees, and then swinging back all around to Portsea again, it's a lot of holiday homes, old money. Generally, if you're down that end, it's you're sort of locked down there. You've got one road in, essentially. You've got one major road in, and in summertime, that's that's really busy. So you can be stuck there trying to get anywhere. It's a real nightmare. So there are definite buyer types that stick to general areas. We see a lot of downsizers coming off either acreage or larger blocks into Mornington, because it offers you sort of healthcare and convenience for shopping and smaller manageable gardens, newer builds that have got, downstairs master bedrooms, and, it's flat walking distance to beach and shops. So it's a lifestyle that we are amongst your demographic. And so, Mornington sort of suits that sort of buyer. Mount Eliza's, a lot of families. There's some really wealthy areas in Mount Eliza as well. So, one of the areas that I guess has probably suffered with the land tax changes is the acreage market. It had a real run during COVID for buyers who wanted the hobby farm, but then it was costing $50,000 to $70,000 a year in land tax to hold those ones, and so a lot of those ended up being sold off, and now it's a bit of a depressed market, if you like, in that acreage side. So it's really just an owner-occupier sort of play for that at the moment.
Yeah, you're right. Because before you could sort of, A, the land tax was not as much, and B, you could sort of negative gear it, particularly. Are you seeing that's double kind of another leg down, with this sort of budget that, a new investor that could sort of, I'm happy to pay land tax, but because it's deductible, but I just can't even make it work now because of negative gearing changes. It's like it's another hit to that market. Have you seen any additional negative?
Yeah. And I think it's probably hit acreage market the most because the land value's the biggest component, but it's affected all markets on the peninsula because we weren't a heavy reliance on investors anyway, but we now really don't have any investors in the market. So you're losing a buyer segment. Holiday homeowners, again, they're not sure whether they want to take on that additional holding cost. So, a market that really needs a balanced buyer pool is lacking one or two of those. And so you've got a lack of demand and confidence, which it'll return with some stability on rates, and maybe some government spending and things like that. That I know the Victorian state elections came up in November, but it's really down on confidence. The value proposition is absolutely still there, because it's still, the rental yields aren't strong, but you've still got price relief from Melbourne. So for families that are wanting a large block family home close to schools, it's still a lot cheaper than 45 minutes drive north.
Yeah, I mean, go there in the summer and go for a swim. You can see why everyone spent $5-10 million for a holiday home down there on the sort of water. And I think a lot of people do want that sort of community lifestyle, and they want to be able to still get to the city when they can. I think there's probably a challenge there. The land tax, the ATO have come in around rules around using your holiday homes, obviously the negative gearing. So you've completely hit a lot of investors. I'm sure there's some pockets that are a bit more dangerous to enter than others. Some are probably still, haven't got a huge second home or a holiday home market, and they're, a lot of owner occupiers are moving in there. And, even if a few of the investors sell, then it's probably still okay. But then I'm sure there's other markets where, there's, as soon as there's a bit more demand, there'll be still a lot of people that probably want to get out of those properties. Is that a lot of your work now? Is just being really careful, what opportunities you help your clients pursue, and being really aware of, where there is a bit of a risk with, more people potentially selling in time and just not having that scarcity impact.
Yeah, there's definitely, a lack of demand for, on properties that need some work done. Particularly properties that may have appealed to a holiday home buyer where they had a great view, might have been away from a village where it sort of felt great to have a holiday, a bit of an escape, but now those buyers aren't there. No one really wants to be there. So you've got, a real lack of demand. So, there's pockets in every suburb like that you need to avoid. If you are, and it depends on the brief, if you're an owner builder and you want to do the improvements yourself, well, there's some great buying to be had in those properties where there's not a market for it, which once you've improved it, there will be. So it really comes down to what they're looking for, and us sort of guiding them on opportunities that suit their needs, that they might be able to do something to, which then creates mass appeal.
Are you finding that the, obviously the stereotypical sort of a house in Brighton or Hawthorne or wherever it might be, and I have my house down the Mornington Peninsula, and I'll, flip and tween in summer and etc. And you find that, because I guess the counter to, what we've experienced the last few years with these flats, it's like, we'll go in all in on one home. Like, do you just go in for a nicer house in eastern suburbs of Melbourne, or do you just, and do you just go for a nicer house down Mornington? Are you sort of seeing that as well? It's not just people, selling the holiday home. They're actually potentially going, okay, well, now the kids are a bit older, they're probably time they left home and, live with some friends. We're just going to sell our house in Melbourne and just get our sort of next 10, 20-year home down the coast.
Yeah, that's exactly what was happening a lot during the COVID boom. We were seeing a lot of empty nesters trying to retain something in Melbourne, whether it was an apartment or a townhouse, and they would then buy a luxury beach house, Blairgowrie, Sorrento, Portsea, Flinders. That would be their primary residence, so they wouldn't be paying land tax on that. They'd still have a connection to Melbourne for their friends and family and sporting events, and a place to stay, if their kids wanted to come and stay. And then also conversely, where they were permanently residing on the peninsula, they had guest accommodation. Yeah, so that was a big trend in sort of 2020, 21. Since then, though, I think the confidence of getting a good price to sell their family home in Melbourne to do the downsize has really impacted their decision making. So we still see that trend, but it's definitely not as much as it was. And I think once confidence returns to that Melbourne market, those properties will come on. They'll then do the downsize exercise. But I think for the moment, that's kind of parked. But we are definitely seeing that the Melbourne buyer is looking to maybe retire, coming to sort of that Mornington area more so than further down, unless they were keeping something in Melbourne. So they still want to be close enough to commute if they're not going to keep a Melbourne property.
It's that age-old problem, right, where people they don't want to sort of do the first transaction, sell, because it doesn't feel great. We paid X for it, we paid stamp duty. Like, I know it was worth this, back in 2022. oh, let's just hold on. But if you're buying and selling in the same market, the market you're buying is probably even in a worse market, and you ultimately want to make it happen. Like,
It's the time to do it.
yeah, exactly. And I think it's so hard, right? It's sort of sometimes people are just they're kind of self-sabotage, isn't it? Almost where you're not looking about the next transaction. You're still it's sometimes the social impact of people knowing you haven't sold it for a great price. You're finding that's really and is that true? Like often, obviously, every market's different from what they've got, but if they've got a semi-decent house in sort of Melbourne, like that arbitrage to buy on the Mornington Peninsula is probably looking way better than it has looked for years, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's these types of markets where you want to be doing that changeover, or even the upgrade, because the gap is a lot less. And where there's been examples of properties that have sold down here lately in Mount Martha where, they've had price reductions that are well below replacement cost. And, you only need the market to return back to a sort of semi-confident level and you're already up 20, 30%. So it's about being brave, but also having a sort of holistic view on your property strategy and not going with the herd, but actually making a decision based on your objectives and not what everyone else is wanting to do. And I think those buyers that do that, they're the ones that end up in front. It's the ones that join in with the masses that end up buying at the top of the cycle. And then, like what we saw, the mass rush into a property in 2021, a lot of those buyers are probably still behind on what they paid 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah, it's interesting. When you're looking at the, the asset quality, you might have always looked at it, but you'll probably always assume there'd be investors and always assume there'd be people buying, second homes and weekenders and, holiday homes. Are you sort of now going, okay, let's not assume that market's there or it's there at a much smaller capacity, and we have to really know that, not only what do I want, but what would a young family want? What would a couple want? Like, trying to find more owner-occupier buyer pools that, that knowing that if that client ever wants to sell one day, that's what's going to kind of drive its price more than ever, rather than, or you still feel like that second home sort of holiday home market may come back, or investor market might come back at some point.
Look, we are a lifestyle market. We have beaches and wineries and, there's mountain biking and hiking, and there's all sorts of outdoor activities that are going to draw tourists and those who want to have in a holiday home. So I think there's always going to be a demand at some level for that. What we do though, when we're helping a client buy, whether it's for a holiday home or an owner occupier, it's always about making sure that we're protecting the resale of that property. So is there going to be mass demand for that when you go to sell? There's no point buying something that's cheap that nobody wants, because you're going to inherit that problem when you go to sell it. So we always look for making sure that it's located really well, that it has mass appeal, that it's going to meet, the needs of the type of person who might be that buyer. So if it's a family home, is it going to be near schools? Is it going to be near transport? Is it going to be walking distance to things? So all of the needs of a family, we need to make sure, whether you're an investor or a holiday home owner or an owner occupier, that you're ticking those boxes, because you need to have that demand when you sell it as well.
Is there any other supply challenges going on down there? I mean, obviously we're building a lot all over the country, but is there pockets that you try to really, or parts maybe you want to be on this side of the freeway, or where that this is all landlocked? Because the further you go up the peninsula, it is, right. That's true. But when you get to sort of that middle part, there's a lot of land, right? So how are you sort of thinking about that, and just, I guess, educating your buyers just to make sure, Mornington's going to change a lot over the next 10, 20 years, and we kind of want to be avoiding or staying clear of these pockets.
Yeah. And look, that is also, like, that's a challenge for a lot of buyers who want to see change. They're from Melbourne, they've had holidays down here, they have a budget, and they come down and they think, this is the area that we can have a nice modern family home, and it's only 2 kilometres from the beach, but they're actually not beachside, and there's a real distinction between beachside and non-beachside. And so there's a lot of those estates that have been, the land's been released in different decades, and they all have very similar architecture of that time. And what the inevitable thing of living in those communities is that you don't see the water. You're very rarely using the beach, and your community and your friends and your infrastructure all is in your small precinct. And so you're not really having a sea change. Yes, you can jump in the car and drive to the beach, but you don't feel like you're in a coastal environment. And so there is more land that will continue to be rezoned that goes all the way out to the Murdoch Highway and then even past that. It's going to happen as the population grows. Now, that's really the only corridor where there's going to be growth, because the rest of the peninsula is really tightly regulated with subdivision and also, the infrastructure. So it's really just that top end that I think is going to be any supply risk. But it's definitely a conversation that we have with clients, just so they're aware that, yes, you can buy an updated family home and you can be 5 to 10 minute drive from the water. But if you're looking for that true sea change lifestyle, maybe it's better finding a block closer to the water that's got a house that you can improve yourself over time, where you're really valuing the land as the greater component of that property, and the lifestyle will be completely different. And so that's the conversation that we have. And some people know that that's not important to them, that they're happy just to be in a comfortable house and be in the car, and that's okay. But knowing the difference and knowing how that impacts your lifestyle, I think, is a really important conversation to have early on.
How does the schools play out? I mean, we talked about the empty nester and the sort of the downsizer, but I think what drives prices the most is, over the longer term, is when you get that sort of, younger sort of demographic, moving in, gentrifying, wanting to, basically create forever homes. So which typically probably they would go to Melbourne, right? They'd buy a little place in, the inner north or, somewhere Bayside, down near Hampton. But, as they sort of can get flexibility of work and their budget, they go, well, no, I want a lifestyle shift. How do they start thinking about the schools? Are there any black zones and, even private schools that, they got a lower purchase price, so they've got a bit extra cash for private? How do you help them think that through?
Yeah, schooling's a difficult one on the peninsula because there's not a lot of schools, and they tend to be concentrated to the northern end of the peninsula, particularly the secondary schools. So you have a lot of state schools with primary schools and like Catholic primary schools and things like that. But the secondary schools really start sort of Rosebud, Dramana, Mornington, Mount Eliza. So they're sort of the top end. And then you have the private schools like Balcombe Grammar, Toorak Girls College and Peninsula Grammar. So and there's also Padua, which is a Catholic secondary, but you have they're all at the top end. So for families who still want to retain their Melbourne jobs, but really want good schooling, they can still do that in those Mount Martha, Mornington, Mount Eliza suburbs, because they have the schools, the communities, and the access to transport. So that's why that area's really resilient to the time of year for the market, and also the buyer pool tends to be a little broader because you've got, all of those features that the southern suburbs or the southwestern suburbs don't really offer.
Have you seen a huge shift in, I'm up in a similar type of pocket in Sydney, or I'm up near the Avalon sort of Northern Beaches pocket, and it's maybe, it's a similar type of people move here because they want the lifestyle shift, but pre-COVID, maybe it was a lot of people that, grew up here, but, have you seen that there's this, and that also gives, I guess, the next wave of buyers, because people are also making that lifestyle shift, and there's more young families. Like obviously, I think, how long have you lived down there? And, particularly have you seen that, shift year on year, and quite a big difference to say 5-10 years ago?
Well, I was one of those that moved here, 2013. So been here now for 13 years. And, I think I saw something recently. It was an article in The Age, I think it was, where someone said it's not until 8 years until they accept you as a local. That's probably fairly true. But I think even in my friendship group, I've got a mixture of friends who've done the same thing. They've moved from Melbourne and they've created a life with young families down here because of all of the outdoor space and those aspects that you want to have a better balance of work life. But also a lot of friendship group that actually grew up down here, moved to Melbourne for jobs and travelled overseas, and And then when it was time to settle down and have a family, moved back. So I think there's actually a good balance of both of those types of buyers, that either relocating or returning. And, they tend to buy in the same sort of areas because of access to schooling and childcare and, sports communities and even, access to transport if they did retain their jobs in Melbourne.
Michael, I think you've highlighted there's just a lot going on in the sort of Mornington pocket. I think it's one of those markets, if you are, can be a bit, counter-cyclical. If you are being that lifestyle shift, you've got a lot of cash. You're not worried so much around sort of, cash flow and negative gearing. It's a good time to get that second home. So I really appreciate you coming on today. I think it's one of those pockets that it's undoubtedly beautiful, but it's also, having a really interesting time, obviously with all the changes going on. I think you need now more than ever, great help. So thanks so much for coming on.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me, Chris.
Thanks so much for listening today. We hope you got lots of value out of it. If you'd like to speak to our guest today, there's links in the show notes on how you can get in contact. And if you're buying your first home, upgrading, renovating, or need any finance-related queries, obviously we'd love to help. There's links in the show notes to us as a mortgage broker, and we look forward to next week's episode.